following is a CUNY TV special presentation.
I'm Bob Darnell. I'm the president and scientific director and the CEO of the New York Genome Center, where you're sitting right now. I'd like to welcome you all here and take a few minutes to introduce why we exist and our place in Lower Manhattan and our connection to your group here at ABNY. So I'm a thoroughbred New Yorker. I trained at and have worked as a physician or a scientist at almost every institution around New York: Columbia, Mount Sinai, Weill Cornell, Rockefeller University, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, the VA hospitals in the Bronx, at Queens, and I would say in sum, I've been both enthralled by science and medicine, doing both of them, but always frustrated by the fact that they miss a little bit. You know, the academics and what you want to do for the patients don't connect all that well. Until last year, when I became president here, I've become increasingly aware of the fact that you're sitting in an institution that is at the heart of a revolution in what's going to happen to patients who are sick in New York, including ultimately all of us. We're all patients. So I'll give you a couple of anecdotes to explain my interest here and what this revolution is about. So going back to being a scientist, when I was getting my PhD, I sequenced 140 base pairs of DNA that were important in pregnancy and stolen by tumor cells, important biologically. It took me 1 year, so I sequenced one base pair every other day. Now hold that thought in mind and think, I'm going to put that in the perspective of what the Genome Center can do now and how this is transformative for healthcare. So the Genome Center that you're sitting in opened in September. It was built on the backs of, first of all, the major academic medical centers here in the city and the major hospitals, each of which 12 in total chipped in $2.5 million into the center of the table that form the core of the Genome Center. So it's really a consortium, an academic medical consortium at its heart. And that consortium attracted the interest of philanthropy. Russ Carson, Jim Simons, Ivan Seidenberg are our co-chairs here. Jim is our major philanthropic contributor. And then attracted interest from the city. New York Economic Development Council has been a major contributor, for example. The mayor's office has been a big help. And New York State, Governor Cuomo has recently put into the budget $105 million, which passed. Nearly $56 million of that is going to come to this building and this neighborhood. So we are going to build 500 jobs to fill out this building. We've already got 80 people hired since opening in September. We're hiring at a rapid rate. And what are we going to do with all of that? Resources and people capital. So going back to that 140 base pairs I sequenced as a graduate student and jump ahead to the current time, in this building, and you're invited, all of you, to take a tour afterwards if you want and see, this is a state-of-the-art genome center that simply didn't exist in New York 2 years ago. And so I would say genomics was sort of an academic enterprise, going to Boston, going to St. Louis, going to Seattle. Now my interest in coming here is that I don't want to build an academic enterprise, I want to build something brand new, which is a consortium of different hospitals, different scientists, different kinds of people, mathematicians down to physicians and genomic and computer people in the middle, who can handle huge amounts of data. And what do I mean by big data? If you go and look at the machines here, these machines can sequence, instead of 140 base pairs in a year, they can sequence 75 million base pairs every second. So how many things do you know in life that have improved by about 65 trillion-fold in the last 30 years? This is an unbelievable revolution. Without getting into the science of what we can do with that data, I can just tell you that this is transformative for medicine. Instead of, the big hype when President Clinton announced the sequencing of the human genome that took thousands of people, hundreds of thousands of man-hours to sequence the first person, I could sequence any one of you in a day. And if you were sick, that would be important. Or if you had a sick child, that would be important. Or if you had a tumor. And in fact, the Genome Center is very focused on trying to do clinically actionable genomics. Not an academic enterprise, but something that harnesses all the power of the different institutions in New York, brings them together for the sake of producing recommendations of what drug could treat you or your tumor or your illness if you were sick. The answer to many diseases lies in broken DNA, broken nucleic acids, and we want to make clinical genomics actionable for you, for your patients. Well, maybe not too many of you are doctors, but I am, and so I live and breathe this space. So I would say also, in nod to Bill Rudin and his support for endurance athletics. I'm a triathlete. I'm signed up for the New York City Triathlon again this year. My wife finished the Boston Marathon on Monday in 3 hours and 28 minutes. She's an animal. But you know, I know what endurance is, and endurance is going to be required to take these ideas I'm so excited about, and I think you can feel my enthusiasm for making a transformative change in medicine and making it happen. There's many hurdles and bottlenecks that we need to overcome. We need your help. We need your enthusiasm. We need it to spread throughout the city. New York is going to be the center of the genomic healthcare revolution. So with that in mind, again, I'll invite you all to come take a visit and see what these state-of-the-art machines look like. And it's my pleasure now to introduce Bill Rudin. Bill, a couple of comments. Comes from a family of renowned leaders. He has a history of creating private and public partnerships to foster a better New York. Bill is a visionary, has focused much of his personal attention and professional energy on rebuilding Lower Manhattan, in addition to his dedication to numerous boards and philanthropic endeavors. So the New York Genome Center is honored to host this important panel to discuss the infrastructure of New York and to help to offer our help in any way we can. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. That's your step. Thank you for hosting us this morning and talking about this incredible building and what you and your team are doing here, transforming biomedical research and ultimately saving lives. And I think the fact that you're here in this location really points to what we're going to be talking about today in infrastructure. And it's an infrastructure you can't see. And I believe if I asked Dr. Darnell why you were here, one of the reasons is because in this location, probably one of the major concentrations of fiber is running through the streets. And my family owns a building a couple of blocks south here, the former AT&T building, which is probably one of the world's well-known data centers. It has similar type of computing power, and the reason why that's there is because of the fiber that's in this street. And this is what we're talking about, infrastructure today. And we have an incredible panel that will talk about infrastructure that you see and infrastructure that you can't see, and how important it is for the future of this city and to continue to expand on what Dr. Darnell's is doing, not just here, but throughout the whole city. And we are honored to have participated in the release of Caution Ahead, the report that Jonathan Bowles and his team at the Center for Urban Future worked on and really, I think, stated the issues that we need to face if we want to continue to grow the city and to have not just one genome center, but other genome centers and other facilities like this that will propel us into the 21st century and beyond and create jobs, save lives, and economic opportunity. We want to thank Jonathan for this report, and I want to particularly also thank Chris Hamill and his team at RBC Capital. Chris is on the panel for their underwriting and support and recognizing how important this report is and what it means for our city. And it is now my pleasure to welcome the moderator, Jonathan Bowles, who will introduce this star-studded panel to discuss the report and the future of our city and infrastructure. Jonathan, thank you.
It is important that we're here at the Genome Center because what we're doing here is so important to the future of New York City's economy. But I think that we undertook the Caution Ahead report just because infrastructure is so much of a foundation for New York City's economic growth as well. And just a little quick word about the study. If you haven't seen it, you could take a look. It's at our website, nycfuture.org. But last month, we did publish this study that took a look at a range of infrastructure vulnerabilities facing New York City. I think we all know that Superstorm Sandy highlighted some critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, particularly around storm preparedness, resiliency. But we thought it was very important to take a broader, more comprehensive look at the overall infrastructure issues facing New York City. Obviously, this is a city that was built up in the early part of the 20th century. So many of our bridges, roads, subways, so many other things that really lay the foundation for New York's success were built a long time ago. We document in the report that a significant number of our bridges are decades old. 11% of all the city bridges are structurally deficient, or at least were in 2012. More than 1,000 miles of water mains in New York City are over 100 years. Not surprisingly, then, we have more than 400 water main breaks a year. Of the subway's system's 728 miles of mainline signals, about 37% exceed their useful life. 370 of the city's public school buildings were built before the Great Depression. I could go on and on. The sewer pipes, the gas mains, so much of our infrastructure is decades old and subject to malfunctions and wear and tear. And the report is very clear about the fact that New York's infrastructure has come a long way in the last 25, 30 years. But there are these infrastructure vulnerabilities, and we believe if we don't start paying attention and taking care of them, there are some economic risks at play for New York. And we've got a really fantastic panel that's here to talk about those vulnerabilities and what we need to do as a city and as a state to take care of them. I think you all know most of these folks, if not all of them on the panel, so I'll be very brief. But at the far end, we have Sam Schwartz, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of Sam Schwartz Engineering, DPC. We have Denise Richardson, who's Managing Director of the General Contractors Association of New York. We have Chris Ward, who's Executive Vice President of Dragados and former Executive Director of the Port Authority. We have Polly Trottenberg, who's the Commissioner of the New York City Department of Transportation, and also Chris Hamill, one of the sponsors of our Caution Ahead report, who's Managing Director and Head of the Municipal Finance Group at RBC Capital Markets. And we're going to try to make this as casual as possible today, but I wanted to start out with Sam just because I wanted to ask, I talked a little bit about the vulnerabilities, the age of our infrastructure, and you've been there 25, 30 years ago in the 1980s. What's at stake for New York? Can you bring us back a little bit? We're not at the same place right now, but what can happen if we don't address our infrastructure challenges?
Okay, I'm kind of the ghost of infrastructure past, and I'm here to haunt you. And I go back to the 70s. I spent 20 years with the New York City DOT, almost all of the 1970s, all of the 1980s. During my tenure at DOT, the West Side Highway collapsed. Cables snapped on the Brooklyn Bridge, killing a Japanese tourist. Part of the FDR Drive elevated at 20th Street collapsed, killing a Brooklyn dentist, crushing him in his car below. I closed the Williamsburg Bridge. There was a federal plan at that time to knock down the Williamsburg Bridge because the communities on both sides were blighted communities, Williamsburg and the Lower East Side. So talk about narrow thinking on that. And I closed some 20 other bridges, and the Manhattan Bridge I took trains off the Manhattan bridges. I didn't do it for fun. There were real risks. We did have some fatalities at that time, and there were fatalities in New York State. Schoharie Bridge collapsed on the thruway. 10 people died in that collapse. The Mianis collapsed. And you'll know more recently about the Minnesota collapse. I'd like to tell you those days are behind us. When it comes to New York City's bridges, which are about half the bridges that we have in the city of New York City DOT bridges, they're in pretty good shape. And we set in motion a program 25 years ago that's been followed And those bridges are in good shape, but the ones that the state owns, like the Kosciuszko Bridge, or some people call it the Kosciuszko Bridge, like the Brooklyn Promenade, which is a triple cantilevered structure that no one has inspected for 60 years, and a study was aborted in 2009. And at that time, we thought it was pretty desperate. Full disclosure, I was one of the consultants, but we ran out of funding. There is no funding for that. So while I'm telling you about infrastructure past and the kinds of problems, we can very well have those problems tomorrow on one of our structures.
Commissioner Trottenberg, that's a good kind of history lesson of where we've been, particularly with transportation infrastructure, and it's your job, you know, in part at least with the city transportation infrastructure, to pay attention to where we are right now. And could you kind of walk us through, our report talks about you know, some deficiencies when it comes to our roads, our bridges right now. Where are we? Are there things that concern you?
The city's bridges are in far better shape than they were back in the days that we had to close the Williamsburg Bridge, and we've put tremendous investment into them. But there's no question, and I thought one thing that's interesting in the report you all did, it points out really, for example, back when we rebuilt all those bridges, there was enormous federal contribution. You know, enormous federal funds were brought to bear. You know, now the sort of the federal share that has typically gone to New York City to invest in bridges and subways and other things is basically flatlined, if not declining. And likewise, you know, city and state coffers aren't flowing either. So I think we've, you know, right now, as you pointed out, we have a lot of bridges that we've managed to get into a state of good repair, but it's an old inventory. New York City DOT, we own 789 bridges. And, you know, as you point out, a lot of them were built in the sort of the burst of the turn of the last century during the expansion of New York in the Tammany era. And it takes a lot of investment to keep them in good condition. And you know, if you let a couple of years go by, you find yourself really moving backwards.
Chris, obviously, we don't just have to take care of transportation infrastructure in the city. You've got some unique experience, obviously with the Port Authority, with DEP. What are some of the other infrastructure challenges that keep you up at night?
Up at night? I'm sorry. I think, I mean, just a few sort of data points taking off what Polly and Sam did. When you think about the Port Authority could spend its entire budget right now essentially on state of good repair and start no new project. Essentially, the MTA is facing that same challenge. Polly's facing that same challenge. And we talk about infrastructure continually, and we all end with, we need to figure out a way to get more money into these projects. We've flatlined with federal funding and state funding as well. And I think what keeps me up at night is the lack of a new model for how we actually fund and finance these projects going forward. And we've run out of the ideas that, you know, fueled this region before. I think we've reached the capacity on the toll network to add any more to that. And unless we are capable of finding a new way to extract wealth out of this incredible city in a way that is egalitarian and fair and is funding these critical projects, we're not going to find a solution to any number one of the problems that any one of these panelists is going to bring up. So for me, I think it's really about creating a new financial model. And I'll just end with, it's not P3s. P3s are like the cold fusion discovery in Utah, which was going to solve all of our energy crisis going forward. P3s have a role, Port Authority's proving that, but they're not a panacea for the lack of a new funding model.
All right, thank you. Chris Hamill, what are your thoughts? I mean, I definitely want to turn the discussion more to a discussion of how do we pay for this? And what's your thoughts about P3s, or what's the better way to fund this?
Sure. I might start with, though, that there are a couple of potholes outside my building at 8th Street in Lafayette, which would be my priority.
Especially after this
That
winter.
keeps me up at night.
Look, I think Chris is spot on. I think that there is a need for a new model and candidly, a new revenue source. But, you know, to develop new revenue sources, I think, you know, you need a programmatic approach that, with candor, builds credibility amongst the public that what they're getting for existing dollars is the value that they deserve. And you know, banged this drum a few times in the course of today's session. It's disappointing to me and to many other folks that follow the infrastructure debate that design build was not reauthorized as part of the budget bill that was passed in this recent legislative session. There's still a shot that it might get done by the end of the session in June, but definitively design build has lowered the cost of building infrastructure. The Tappan Zee Bridge was soft circled at $5 billion. Design build resulted in a cost of $3.4 billion. The bridge between Queens and Brooklyn, I always forget the name of it, I'm a New Yorker, decreased in the amount of time by 42 months in terms of its repairs. The New York State Department of Transportation believes that design build will lower the cost of infrastructure by 27%. So I think you start by saying, what are my existing resources and how can I do more with them? But I think inevitably we will be looking at the need for alternative revenue sources.
Thank you. Denise, what are your thoughts about how to raise new revenues or how to reduce the cost of building infrastructure?
Well, first of all, I think what we've seen with what I'm going to call the infrastructure problem is something that's fundamental in our society, which is an unwillingness to pay for anything. And until we come to grips with the fact that we need to invest in infrastructure and it needs to be a priority at the local level and the state level and the federal level, I don't think we're going to move the needle on finding new sources of revenue to pay for this. When you talk about raising the gas tax, and anybody who's bought gas in the last 3 or 4 weeks has seen that the price has fluctuated. When you talk about raising the gas tax, it's as if we are looking to create a whole new taxing structure that will literally force people to choose between, buying food for their table or getting to work in their cars. And that's not the issue. Raising the gas tax by even a nickel or a dime will help fund the Highway Trust Fund and at least bring it solvent. If you raise it 25 cents, we'll have new money to build new projects, and yet we can't get Congress to move on the issue. But when you poll people and you poll the public, they say, yes, it's time. It's time that we looked at finding new sources of revenue. When you talk about, raising the sales tax to fund transportation, it results in an immediate outcry. And so until we are successful in convincing the public that, yes, they need to be willing to pay for these investments, I think we're going to have a very hard time ahead of us.
I want to get more back to the dedicated revenue sources, but on that note, does anybody on the panel have ideas for how you make that political argument? How do you convince people that this is a crisis or could become a crisis that we need to address? Any thoughts about getting our politicians and policymakers to get behind something like this?
Well, one idea, and those of you who may have been following the Move New York movement, it's an idea to raise revenue for infrastructure, particularly roads, bridges, transit. And in simple terms, where we're sitting right now, there are people that just came through the Holland Tunnel, and they'll pay $12 to come through the Holland Tunnel. There are people that came over the Manhattan Bridge that has 4 tracks, and they paid $0. There are people today that go across the Throgs Neck Bridge, and they'll pay $10.66 to cross the Throgs Neck Bridge, or $15 in cash, $10.66 Easy Pass. But they have no trains. Most of their money that when they go across the Throgs Neck Bridge goes to trains. It goes to the railroads, it goes to the subways. Yet on the Manhattan Bridge, we have 4 tracks. We have lots of trains, and we charge people $0. So just by being fair, and by the way, the 4 East River bridges were all built with tolls, and you remember the fun-loving mayor, William Gaynor, who removed the tolls in 1911. What a mistake that was, and I was the person who had to deal with the bridges because there was no funding source. But if we just change the way we price tolling, we're going to raise and be fair about it, lower the tolls in the outer areas, introduce the tolls on the East River bridges, and coming into the central business district at 60th Street and add a couple of additional fees for taxi trips within the CBD, we're going to raise $1.5 billion a year. And I think it gets to what Polly was saying about don't count on the federal government. Local areas have to solve their problems. LA figured it out. Right now, the biggest amount of transit spending going on is in Los Angeles. It's not in New York. And they tax themselves. They actually passed a referendum to build transit. And to get a tax increase in Los Angeles, it has to go to a referendum, and you have to get 2/3 vote. They got 68% of the people. So don't look to Washington. I'd love to see the gas tax raised. I don't see it happening. New Yorkers, let's figure it out for ourselves.
Commissioner Trottenberg, I know that you've been pretty clear about the need to address some of these issues facing the city with transportation infrastructure. I mean, do you see kind of an appetite in the administration to try to kind of figure out some funding sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually Sam kind of put it well, which is there's a growing recognition, and look, I'm coming from US DOT, and one thing I think we've seen is that there are cities and states around the country that are heavily dependent on federal funds, and some that are less so. New York is, even though we have a big need for federal funds, we're actually less so than a lot of places around the country. And those places that can help themselves are going to be the ones that I think are going to thrive in the coming century. A little cautionary tale about places like LA, though. You can see that there are referenda that pass all over the country where people tax themselves. They usually tax themselves to build new things. They rarely tax themselves to keep up the old stuff. And here in New York, we need to do both. I mean, we're still a growing city, and we need to invest in new things, but we also have an enormous mature infrastructure system. And mainly, I can tell you from New York City DOT, I mean, almost our entire budget is essentially keeping up the old. And we're doing a few new things here and there, select bus service and building out a bike network, but mostly we're maintaining. So that's one of the real sort of political nuts to crack. You can sell people in a budget, in a ballot initiative, we're going to build out a brand new subway system for you, but put on the ballot initiative, we're just going to fix the one you've got, and it's a much tougher sell. So, I mean, of course, look, we're still a new administration, so I think we've got a bunch of things we're going to tackle, and you saw the mayor's remarks on your report. I mean, I think he found it very thought-provoking. I read it, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this is daunting. It's not, I'm worried about the roads and the bridges, but the subways, schools, public housing, the water system. So it's obviously there are a lot of things that the city has to tackle. But of course, we're going to be thinking deeply about, what we're going to do with the capital budget and what's our role going to be in trying to maintain the incredible infrastructure of the city.
Sam talked a little bit about the Move New York proposal, which I think has gotten a lot of people in the room excited. I think that it seems like kind of a politically astute proposal. I think a lot of us are crossing our fingers on it. But obviously that's an important potential new source of funding for transportation infrastructure. What about the other things? Commissioner Trottenberg talked about these other areas of infrastructure which also need to be fixed or upgraded in a lot of ways. Are there other things, and Chris, you've talked about capturing wealth, are there dedicated revenue sources in other areas that might help us fund water infrastructure, other facets of our infrastructure? Are there new mechanisms to capture the wealth that we should be thinking about? I mean, this is kind of open to anybody on the panel, but what else can we do beyond the transportation?
In terms of water, and I will maybe get into trouble here, with what fresh drinking water and sewage does for this city is probably the second most important, maybe the most important thing. And we are now, this administration, struggling with this notion of costs and outer borough costs and low income and middle income and wealthy communities. We're almost shy about talking about how valuable that water system is. And so I think the water rate proposal this year is for like 3.83%, when before it had been around 9, and I think a couple of years it went over 10 and 11%. And I think the tough thing is that sometimes you really have to be bold and you have to say, look, you need to adjust your life for the things that you are purchasing elsewhere, because we're delivering fresh, clean drinking water and providing you with, your sewer system. And if that's not the most valuable thing in your life, you know, you need to figure out how to organize your life a whole lot better. You know, and it's that, and we shouldn't be shy about saying that. I mean, that's such an incredible thing. And so there's a flip side to we're sort of hiding and saying, oh no, we can't fund that because it's going to be too controversial in the MOVE idea. You know, there are a lot of political leaders who are already saying that it's dead on arrival before it's had a chance. And I think you have to sometimes be aggressive and just say, look, this is a really valuable service and you are going to have to pay for it. And as someone who I know and respect says, if you own a home and you can't figure out a way to pay another $100 for fresh, clean drinking water, you shouldn't own a home. That will get me into trouble.
But following up on what Chris just said, and if there's someone here from AT&T, I apologize. But I found it really offensive when I saw a commercial on TV for AT&T offering the family data plan for $160 a month. The happiest day of my life will be when I no longer have a cell phone. So really, you're talking about people spending $160 a month for a cell phone with maximum data, and over $100 a month for the average cable bill. But when it comes to funding, transportation, and water infrastructure, suddenly people can't afford to pay for that. There is definitely something wrong with the picture, and our priorities are seriously out of whack. That's what the fundamental issue is.
Well, let me then pile on in a modestly provocative way. And I think it's sort of, I get what Chris was saying about P3 not being the solution, but I do think it's timely for government to look at infrastructure as an asset on its balance sheet, the way Bill Rudin looks at his balance sheet and the multiple assets he and his family have. And you make decisions about them. Two examples, you know, Ohio State University, in great financial shape, looked at its parking garages and said, you know, we're not really getting the full value out of these because I don't want a lot of professors whining at me when I raise their rates, even though we're charging a below parking price. And frankly, we're not very good at running parking garages. So they sold them off and put the money in the endowment. Allentown, Pennsylvania said, I got a pension problem and I have a successful water system. I'm going to sell it. And they sold their water system. And the highest bidder, incidentally, was not the private sector, was not KKR, which actually happened to be represented by my firm. It was the county in which Allentown was located. And they took the money and they put it in their pension fund, and now they have a 100% funded pension. And the people in those two locations are well served by those two sales. And to pick up on the point that was just made, my hunch is that we're willing to accept from AT&T or Verizon a higher per monthly cost for our cell phone needs than we are to drink terrific water that flows freely from our faucet. And that maybe we're willing to pay the private sector more money than we are to pay government for a comparable service. And I think if we're going to explore a new model and try to figure out where we're going, I think that's worth exploration.
Great points. So we've talked a little bit about, you know, when you were talking about water, you talked about the water board. But I really want to ask again, are there new ways of thinking about this, new dedicated revenue sources? I mean, there's a fair question about should we be having water board increases more than what has been proposed. But I think that, you know, different organizations from the Building Congress to Citizens Budget Commission and ours have talked about pay-as-you-throw. They've talked about residential parking permits. There's a lot of other surface water management fee, which Seattle does. And you know, are there ideas beyond the transportation charges that you're talking about that we as a city should be thinking about? Just because, like you said, the federal government doesn't seem like they're going to come to our rescue this time.
Me?
Anybody?
Well, I think on the issue of water, there's definitely a public education component that needs to be talked about. And I do think it would be helpful if there were some way for the city to talk to the public about X amount of your bill is related to the capital investment cost of the system, and X amount of your bill is actually the variable charge based on your actual water usage, because there really are two components. And I think it would be helpful if people understood better that a big portion of their water rate goes into maintaining the system infrastructure. And what you saw in the past few years were significant water rate increases that were necessitated by the need to meet federal consent order mandates. And we can get into a whole separate discussion about that. But that's what really drove the spike in the water rates, that the city had to build the Croton filtration plant, had to build the Cat-Del UV facility, and make some significant upgrades to the wastewater treatment system to meet federal requirements. And that's what drove up the rates. At the same time, what that meant was that the city is now the beneficiary of the cleanest water in the rivers and the harbor in the last 100 years. And that's invaluable, really. You can't put a price on that. The city is also the beneficiary of, with the Croton filtration plant, of really being able to maximize the usage of the Croton system for the first time in generations. And that's 10% of the city's water supply. So that's retrieving an asset that was, teetering on the brink of being unusable. So those investments really matter. And I think the issue with water is educating the public to make them understand that there really is a value in what they pay for. It's not just a tax.
Obviously, I agree wholeheartedly with Denise on that. I think following on a couple of ideas, and I didn't mean to say in any way, since the company that I work for is probably the largest P3 infrastructure provider in both Canada and the United States. So I'm a keen proponent on P3s. I think we need to recognize, just as you said, they fall in particular market niches where you have either, in the case of the Port Authority, where you have exhausted your financial capacity and you're basically using somebody else's money to finance a critical need that over time you will end up paying them back. But since you don't have the money and you want to build a new LaGuardia airport, you borrow from a private equity fund to build it. And I would tee off the challenge that I think the Port Authority is facing with LaGuardia. And I feel like I've created a trend here now where every elected official says that LaGuardia is crap and you need to tear it down. I mean, Joe Biden even felt that when he came to New York, he had to say it. But we do need to replace LaGuardia. And there's a case where there are some niche fee structures where you have people who are looking for such a service, flying, the amount that a ticket costs. There's elasticity in how people use LaGuardia Airport, where you could very simply impose a user fee for bringing a private car onto LaGuardia Airport and use the Easy Pass system to collect $2 every time a private car comes onto LaGuardia Airport. And that's to pay for the infrastructure that the car, by not using mass transit or buses, which we need to talk long-term also. But there's an elasticity in the ticket price of an airline ticket that you could put $2 on it. And don't tell me someone's going to go, well, I'm not going to fly out of LaGuardia anymore because there's $2. You could raise an enormous amount of money. And I think those are the sort of niche ideas. You're not going to get a wholesale transformation of extracting wealth, as I put it. You need to find markets where there's a high demand, that there's a capital and a financing structure that fits, that doesn't disrupt the market. Can I do one more? If people talk about congestion in this city, and everybody on this panel has talked about it a lot, the number one driver that people hate the most about congestion in this town and talk about it all the time are trucks. We are seeing a 27% increase in truck traffic over the next 5 to 7 years. That amount of goods movement within this region, and I mean intra-regional, I'm not talking about the Jerry Nadler rail freight tunnel, I'm just talking about the trucks that are moving around the city. It is one of the most inefficient networks that we have for delivering things in and around the city. And there is wealth in that world that I think you really can extract and then have a major funding stream going forward. Because if you own a deli and the guy next door to you owns a hardware store, 2 different trucks will drive to that same neighborhood to deliver the food to the deli and the hardware to the hardware store. We have zip codes for how mail gets distributed, but we have no rationalization of how trucks move around the city. And you could rationalize those trucks, create franchise districts of who compete within to deliver into that area. They would be responsible for paying for the upkeep of where they are, and they would then have the market opportunity to service goods distribution in those franchise areas. What's good about it is it's an equalization that doesn't discriminate against one part of the economy and another part of the economy, because pretty much our entire economy right now is fueled by delivery of goods and services within the city. And I think that is long-term something that the city and the Port Authority should really, really consider in figuring out how to price trucks in a way that they're traveling in the right direction, that they are alternative fuel vehicles, and that they are meeting all the surface road requirements. And then you create franchises, and they're paying for the privilege of serving that area, and you use that money to then build out the infrastructure in that particular part of town.
Questions, Bill?
Well, first of all, panel, you did an incredible job. We're going to open up to question and answers, and I think there's a tremendous amount of ideas that have been floated, and hopefully some things that we can literally take to the bank to help underwrite, all the things that are needed to get done. Dr. Darnell was reminding me before, when he was talking about his consortium, this is what ABNY is about, bringing people together, trying to solve the problems and come up with innovative ideas. My first question, I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative. My first question, nobody really talked about ferry service and transportation. And, this is really for you, Commissioner. What do you see as the city's plan moving forward? It's relatively, I know the ferry service is subsidized now, and looking forward, how do we improve it? How do we utilize our waterways better and more efficiently and take advantage of all the things that are happening in the outer boroughs and bringing people back and forth from the East River?
Yeah, that's a good question, and just as I forgot which mayor it is made the bridges free, you may recall several mayors ago, the mayor made the Staten Island Ferry free. Once you make something free, you never go back. Look, I think the way the ferries work in New York now, it's so complicated. New York City DOT runs a Staten Island ferry. It's really the Economic Development Corporation that is sort of overseeing now some of the private ferry services that we have. And it's funny, I was in Greenpoint yesterday, actually, and there's a frustration there right now. The G train is going to be shutting down for part of the summer, and right now the pier, the private ferry was using, collapsed, and so there's a concern in that neighborhood about, well, our transportation options are going to be a little light this summer. I think it's an area where there's a lot of potential, but so far, generally, ferry service around the country is pretty heavily subsidized. So there has to, this is another area where there has to be a real commitment of resources. And look, I've spent a lot of time really getting up to speed on our operations for the Staten Island Ferry. And, particularly appropriately so, we have a very, very involved, state-of-the-art, intensive safety regime. And look, we can think about the terrible thing that just happened in South Korea. You need that in ferry operations. But it doesn't necessarily, it's not something you can therefore kind of do on the cheap. You really need to do ferries right. And I think, they've shown they can be, wonderful economic drivers. But, again, in the sort of the discussion of where do we get the resources for the basics, you have to think hard about, and then where do we get the resources to add on new capacity and things like ferries.
Commissioner, to the Staten Island Ferry, Mike McMahon from Staten Island. Let's not talk about rolling back the free ferry.
Don't worry, it'll never be rolled back.
But when I was in the city council and in Congress, we talked often about finding a way to capture the non-commuters and charge them a fee on the ferry. There were studies that were in legislation to count the commuters, and then once you had those numbers, to charge a fee. There's some 2-3 million tourists who take the ferry every day would gladly pay a few bucks for that ride. So I'd urge you to consider a sort of dual system where the daily commuters can ride for free and those who are not could pay a fee.
Yeah, I don't see how that's feasible. I don't know how you would separate out who's a commuter and who's a tourist.
By having a car.
But then why wouldn't everyone just get a car? That sounds great. I don't know that that's sort of practical or fair, but
I just want to say that I guess I feel, and I know there'll be a lot of people in the tech community would feel that this is not, this is not really your enemy. I feel like this should be your friend. And there's information that you can get out about water, about trucks, about ferries, about, you know, bridges, all these different things on here. And, you know, yes, the ads for new cell phone service or whatever, or, you know, might be upsetting to you, but it's because it's in your face. This is our water, in a certain sense. This is a lifeline to a lot of people in a certain way. And I just feel like, make it your friend, not your enemy. You know, an extra pair of shoes, you know, I'd say I'd give up that before I'd give up fresh water. You know, there's a lot of extra things. I'm not sure this is extra at this point.
Well, it's also a way to use as a way to get revenue. You can use your iPhone if you want to get on the ferry, and if you're a local resident, you can have an app that lets you, you sign up and you get free service if you're, and if you're.
You get out data that is,
Right, but it's multi, functional. So I encourage people to look, the same technology you're talking about using for going to the to JFK or LaGuardia,
Yep.
It's an easy pass in your pocket.
That's work.
Thank you. Aren't we living in some ways in a golden age of new investment? Moynihan, extension of the 7 line, East Side access to Grand Central, and all these new capital investments, Second Avenue subway. I mean, it feels to me like while we have a lot to do to maintain, we're doing a lot of new things. And the other part of that question is there room for the 5-year capital plan created by Dick Ravitch to help fund MTA improvements in any of these new ways to raise money? I also want to make a pitch. I've grown to love LaGuardia because it's so compact compared to other airports, even though it's unattractive. Just want to say.
Good for you. I'll take a shot at that one. And this isn't the sort of glass half full, half empty. I think clearly the 2 projects that you mentioned, East Side Access and Second Avenue and the 7 train, are all incredibly important in an expansion of the system. And Mayor Bloomberg is to be truly credited with the financing mechanism of the 7 train, which is, again, an innovative way to do tax increment financing for major infrastructure. I think we missed a huge opportunity for that on the west side of Manhattan after the park, the Hudson River Park was built. You could have done another tax increment financing there for improvements. So those have all been great, but let's be candid. Moynihan Station is not, rapidly advancing. And in fact, it's facing enormous amounts of challenges. We do not have an East River crossing for rail, and we won't have one for another 25 or 30 years. I mean, the fact that in the United States, Amtrak says that we're going to bring high-speed rail to the Northeast Corridor in 50 years. That just doesn't seem inspiring to me that we're going to do something that critical and it's going to take 50 years. I mean, I think the Wright brothers flew in 1903 and they only went 285 feet. So we don't have an East River crossing. I mean, we don't have a West River crossing. We don't have Moynihan Station. We don't have a new LaGuardia. We don't have an expansion of Newark Airport that you desperately need. We do not have a one-seat ride to Kennedy. I'll be gentle, Bill, about the path system going to Newark. I'm a little cautious about that one. So if you look at the list of new projects that we would want to do, given what you just heard in terms of state of good repair, I wouldn't call it a golden age. I think we should look back proudly on what the city does for itself when it does face the need to do things, but I definitely wouldn't characterize it as a golden age.
But I also think that we spent 50 years, you figure from the early 1960s to now, building nothing new. So we're still trying to catch up and bring the infrastructure to where the city needs it to be now, much less building infrastructure to move forward for the next 50 years. So I think we'll be in a catch-up mode forever, frankly.
I am really, really thrilled to hear all of your comments today. I'm a historic preservationist, not an economist. But I think the first comment that comes to mind for me when I was reading the report was just how most of the people that I'm aware of don't appreciate the infrastructure that they have until it's not working. So you don't appreciate the water until it stops running out of the faucet, or the electricity until it stops working. So I think there's something to be said about how do we nourish and nurture a sense of the value, the inherent value of the infrastructure that we already have. The other thought that I had was when so much of our infrastructure was constructed, particularly our water and our sewer infrastructure and our subway infrastructure, in the past, in the 19th century particularly, there was a tremendous amount of civic pride that was instilled in observing the infrastructure. For people that passed by the infrastructure, they would just say, this is something that is an investment by our community in the longevity of this city. And I think that within the last 50 years, so much of the infrastructure investment is not communicating that sense of inherent civic pride. And I just wonder if there might be some comment about that particular issue. The last thing I will say is that having studied Roman aqueducts that are still operating 2,000 years later, there's something to be said about also the Roman highway infrastructure that used basalt and was very inherently sustainable and long-lasting. Thank you.
I think a fundamental problem is that there is almost no constituency for infrastructure. And a lot of the infrastructure work that needs to be done is not sexy. It is painting the underside of a bridge. It's lubricating movable parts. It's changing a signal system on the subway. Nobody goes out and cuts a ribbon to announce a program to take care of that. One of the things that I had hoped to leave as a legacy when I was leaving city government is we fought to get something in the charter that said we'll report on the state of our infrastructure. And we wanted that to be a document that the public could understand. And we wanted it to be done by a chief engineer, a person who's a licensed engineer, and instead what happened was the Office of Management and Budget took over and produced a document that I'm a professional engineer, I can't make heads or tails of. If we really want to find a ton of money, there's a ton of money for the future, and that is by just doing basic maintenance. What we hope to do is show, and I think Chris mentioned asset management, is if you have an asset, you take a certain percentage. In an infrastructure, it's about 2 to 3% to do preventive maintenance. So if our assets are mega trillions of dollars, we should have develop a religion or a law that says we have to maintain that infrastructure. If we do that, we're going to unleash a ton of money, because what we had to do with the city bridges is instead of lubricating certain parts of bridges, those parts froze and we had to replace the steel. Instead of painting and coating the steel, those beams were collapsing. So if we adopt that religion by 2030, 2040, 2050, we'll have a ton of money if we do the job right.
One more, last question.
Could you tell me the funding source for the third water tunnel, which I think is one of the largest infrastructures that the city and the state have been involved in, and it certainly relates to water rates. How is that funded?
The rate.
It was funded out of the Water Finance Authority, paid for by the water rates.
But we didn't have water rates, 20 years ago.
Actually,
water was free.
It was built into before the Water Finance Authority was created. It was built into your property taxes, so it was invisible, but it was still there.
Which again was, I'm sorry, Bill, go ahead. No, I was just saying, which again was a new model to pull it out of the property tax, which fluctuated wildly, creating a more stable revenue stream, which the Water Finance Authority was then able to borrow against and build out the third water tunnel.
Last question.
With the Federal Highway Trust Fund possibly going bankrupt in August, what effect would that have on the MTA or in general transportation in New York City?
Do you want to answer city part?
Yeah, I'm probably the one to answer that.
Darn it.
Yeah, I know. Yes, and I think is mentioned here that probably some of the folks in this audience know that the federal gas tax has not been raised in 20 years. It's 18.4 cents a gallon. If you think about what they charge in Europe, you can realize it's pretty low. It takes in about $40 billion a year, give or take. But Congress has authorized us to spend, DOT to spend 50+ billion a year on highways and transit. So there's a huge gap there. And this summer, we're going to start to hit the wall on that gap. There have been a couple times over the past 6 or 7 years where that's happened, because Washington now, in terms of the Highway Trust Fund, kind of lurches from year to year. And what that has engendered in some parts of the country is folks basically taking a look at their all sort of agencies that do capital work usually have 4 or 5, 10-year capital plans, and start to look at, well, are there projects we might need to put on hold? We're not doing that yet in New York City, but I know of state DOTs around the country that are starting to take a look at that. And look, that obviously, when you slow, particularly I would say, when you're building large projects, it's a long, complicated process to get there, a lot of permits, working with federal and state agencies. You don't ever want to slow anything down, because it's a little bit like the bridges. When you slow things down, you just add to cost in the long run. So this is a real sort of crisis that's looming. And as some of you may know, there's a lot of talk in Washington right now about whether they can put together a longer-term bill and what might be some potential revenue sources, but it's certainly not resolved, and it is, we're pretty close to August.
Thank you, panel. Thank you, Jonathan. And, I believe that the offer to take a tour is still available. Where would you like people to meet out? Right outside if you want to take a tour. And thank you. We'll see you.